Saint John Bosco, saw what happens. When you refuse to forgive, you wake up angry. The same argument, the same hurt, the same person who wronged you 5 years ago still taking up space in your head. You tell yourself you have every right to feel this way. They never apologized. They never acknowledged what they did. So you hold on to it, you nurse it, you let it grow. And one night in April 1868, a priest in Turin, Italy, saw exactly where that road ends. Have you ever wondered what unforgiveness actually does to your soul? Not just how it makes you feel today, but where it leads you tomorrow, next year, or at the moment of your death. The Catholic Church has always taught that forgiveness is not optional. It is the currency of heaven. Without it, the doors stay locked. But few people have seen this truth as clearly as Saint John Bosco did when he was dragged through a vision so terrifying that his hand blistered just from touching the outer wall of hell. This is not a story about marriage specifically, though it applies to every relationship you have. This is about what happens when you choose resentment over reconciliation, when you decide that holding a grudge is worth more than holding on to grace. Don Bosco saw it, he wrote it down, and the boys who heard him that night in May 1868 never forgot it. If you value documented Catholic history and the lives of the saints like this, subscribe. It is the best way to support our work. Also comment from which city you are hearing this from. Now, this script is researched and factual, using sources from Don Bosco's own biographical memoirs compiled by Father John Baptist Lemoyne, who lived with the saint from 1864 until Don Bosco's death in 1888, as well as the book 40 Dreams of Saint John Bosco published by Tan Books, which draws directly from those memoirs. These are not legends passed down through centuries. These are first-hand accounts written by men who watched Don Bosco wake up sweating, who saw his hands swell after the dream, who heard him describe what he saw while the memory was still fresh. Now back to the information. John Bosco was born August 16th, 1815, in a stone cottage on the hills of Becci, near Turin. His father died when he was 2. His mother Margaret raised 3 boys in brutal poverty. At age 9, John had the first dream. He saw a field full of boys cursing, fighting, tearing each other apart. He tried to stop them with his fists. Then a man appeared, dressed in light, and said this, not with blows, with gentleness and kindness. Show them that sin is ugly and virtue beautiful. That dream haunted him for the rest of his life. By 1841, John Bosco was ordained a priest. Turin was exploding. The Industrial Revolution had turned northern Italy into a furnace of factories, slums, and orphaned children. Boys as young as 10 worked 14-hour days laying bricks, paving roads, cutting stone. No education, no family, no future. They slept under bridges. They stole to eat. And when they got caught, they went to prison alongside grown men where they learned to become worse criminals. Don Bosco started gathering them on Sundays. First 5 boys, then 20, then 100, then 400. He taught them catechism. He played games with them. He heard their confessions for hours. He found them jobs. He gave them a place to sleep. The authorities thought he was insane. Some priests tried to have him committed to a mental asylum. They actually showed up with a carriage to take him away. Don Bosco tricked them into getting inside, locked the door, and had them driven to the hospital instead. The police followed his group to fields on Sundays, trying to catch him preaching revolution. But all they heard were sermons so powerful that 3 weeks later, one officer said, "If this keeps up, we will all be going to confession." By 1862, Don Bosco had founded the Salesian Society. The oratory of St. Francis de Sales had hundreds of boys living there, learning trades, studying, praying. And throughout all of this, Don Bosco kept having dreams, not every night, but often enough that the boys started to recognize the signs. He would go to bed exhausted. He would wake up more tired than when he laid down. And when he told them what he saw, grown men wept. In May of 1862, he dreamed of 2 columns rising from the sea. One held the Eucharist, the other held a statue of Mary, Help of Christians. The church was a ship under attack, battered by enemy vessels. The Pope was steering it toward the columns. He was struck down. Another Pope took his place, steered toward the columns, and was killed. A third Pope rose, reached the columns, anchored the ship, and suddenly all the enemy ships sank. That dream became famous, but the dream that matters here, the one that shows what unforgiveness does, came 6 years later. April 10th, 1868. Good Friday. Don Bosco had been having nightmares all week. He barely slept. His body ached. His tooth throbbed. He dreaded going to bed because he knew what was waiting for him. On Friday night, he propped his pillow against the headboard and sat up, trying not to fall asleep. But exhaustion won. The moment his eyes closed, a figure appeared beside his bed. The same man from the dreams before, the one Don Bosco called the guide. "Get up and follow me." Don Bosco protested. "I am exhausted. My tooth is killing me. I need rest. Please leave me alone. Get up. You have no time to lose." The guide led him out of the room. Suddenly they were standing on a vast, empty plain. No trees, no water, just yellowed, dried vegetation stretching to the horizon. Don Bosco asked where they were. The guide said nothing. They walked for what felt like hours. Then a road appeared. Beautiful, wide, paved, lined with hedges covered in roses. It looked so inviting that Don Bosco stepped onto it without hesitation. But the road sloped downward, gently at first, then steeper. Don Bosco found himself moving faster and faster, almost gliding, as if the road itself was pulling him. He looked back. How will we get back to the oratory? Do not worry, the guide said. He who leads you on will lead you back. Then Don Bosco saw them. The boys from his oratory, hundreds of them, following him down the road. And one by one they started falling, tripping, crashing to the ground, then sliding faster and faster toward a massive drop in the distance. At the bottom of that drop was a furnace, a bronze gate, and beyond it, fire. Don Bosco looked closer at the ground, traps everywhere, fine as spider webs, invisible unless you looked carefully, and each trap had a label: pride, disobedience, envy, impurity, theft, gluttony, anger, sloth. The boys were getting caught, falling, being dragged down the slope by an unseen force. Don Bosco grabbed one of the threads and tugged. Immediately he felt resistance. He pulled harder, and instead of pulling it toward him, he felt himself being pulled forward. He kept tugging. Finally, a massive, hideous creature emerged from the cave at the bottom, clutching a rope. All the traps were tied to that rope. It was the devil himself, dragging souls to hell one trap at a time. Don Bosco stepped back. He looked at the traps again. Which ones caught the most boys? 3 stood out: impurity, disobedience, pride, and linked to all of them was one more: human respect, the fear of what others think, the unwillingness to do what is right because it might make you look weak or foolish or strange. But there was something else on the ground: knives, swords, hammers, tools for cutting the traps, meditation, spiritual reading, devotion to the Blessed Sacrament, devotion to Mary, and the biggest tool of all, confession. Some boys grabbed these tools and cut themselves free. Others ignored them and kept falling. The guide turned to Don Bosco. Do you know why they fall? Don Bosco watched one boy after another tumble down the slope, crash into the bronze gate, and disappear into the furnace. Some screamed, some reached out for help. None of them stopped. The guide said this: bad companions, bad books, bad habits. These are what dragged them to ruin. Don Bosco cried out, if so many of our boys end up this way, we are working in vain. How can we prevent this? This is their present state. This is where they would go if they died now. Then a new group of boys came tumbling down, and the bronze gate flew open. The guide grabbed Don Bosco's arm. Let us go in. Don Bosco pulled back in terror. Before going to hell, one has to be judged. I have not been judged. I will not go. The guide looked at him. What would you rather do? Visit hell and save your boys, or stay outside and leave them in agony? Don Bosco hesitated. Of course I love my boys and wish to save them all. But is there not some other way out? Yes, provided you do all you can. Don Bosco took a breath. I will go. They stepped through the gate. Instantly the air changed, suffocating heat, greasy green smoke lit by scarlet flames. They walked through a long, narrow corridor lined with 1,000 bronze doors, each one slamming open and shut as more souls came hurtling down. At the far end was a courtyard, and beyond that, another entrance. Above it was an inscription, the 6th commandment. The guide lifted a curtain. Don Bosco looked through and saw boys he knew, boys from the oratory. Some of them seemed like good kids. They were there because of sins of impurity, sins they either never confessed, or confessed badly, or confessed without true sorrow or firm purpose of amendment. Don Bosco asked if he could write their names down. The guide said no. Just preach against immodesty, and tell them to pray. For a firm resolution, one needs God's grace, and that will not be denied to those who ask. They moved deeper. Another hall. Another inscription. Here one could see how atrocious was the remorse of those who had been pupils in our schools. What a torment to remember each unforgiven sin and its just punishment. The countless means they had to mend their ways. The many favors promised and bestowed by the Virgin Mary. What a torture to think that they could have been saved so easily, yet now are irredeemably lost. To remember the many good resolutions made and never kept. Hell is paved with good intentions. That last line, Don Bosco wrote it down word for word. Hell is paved with good intentions. Resolutions made and never kept. Sins confessed but not truly repented. Grudges held, offenses nursed, mercy refused. They went lower, a cavern with walls covered in worms and vermin gnawing at the souls trapped there. Don Bosco recognized more boys. He tried to speak to them. They did not respond. The guide explained, the damned are totally deprived of freedom. Each must fully endure his own punishment with absolutely no reprieve whatever. Don Bosco saw the boys writhing, not from physical fire alone, but from the memory of what they could have done differently. the apologies they could have given, the forgiveness they could have extended, the bitterness they chose to hold instead of letting go. Every unconfessed sin, every grudge, every moment they said, "I will never forgive," that person carved into their souls like a brand. The guide turned to Don Bosco. "Now you too must enter that cavern." "No." Don Bosco backed away. "I have not been judged. Do you want to see or experience?" "I only want to see." "Then come." The guide led him to a transparent wall. On the other side was a massive cave. The walls glowed white-hot, thousands of degrees, but nothing burned. Everything was incandescent, frozen. A boy came hurtling through a gate, screaming, and crashed into the center of the cave. Instantly he became motionless, glowing, silent. Then another. Then another. Don Bosco recognized them, boys from the oratory. He asked why they were so still. The guide said, "Look closer." Don Bosco pressed his ear to the crystal. He heard screaming, blasphemies, sobs, curses against the saints, rage against God, and above it all, a horrible grinding sound, like metal on metal. The sound of souls gnashing their teeth in fury because they had mocked the just, and now the just were in heaven, while they burned. The guide pointed up. The ceiling became transparent. The boys in hell could see heaven. They could see their classmates who had chosen differently, who had forgiven, who had repented, who were now with God. And that vision, that glimpse of what they lost, tortured them more than the fire. Don Bosco turned away. "I have seen enough. Please take me out." "Not yet. You must understand one more thing. Touch this wall." Don Bosco refused. The guide insisted. "Just one touch. So you can say you have both seen and touched the walls of eternal suffering." Don Bosco looked at the wall. The guide explained, "This is the first of 1,000 walls. Each wall is 1,000 measures thick. Each measure is 1,000 miles. This wall is millions and millions of miles from hell's real fire. It is just the remote rim." Then the guide seized Don Bosco's hand, forced it open, and pressed it against the wall. The sensation was so utterly excruciating that Don Bosco leaped back with a scream and found himself sitting up in bed, heart pounding, hand stinging. When he got up that morning, his hand was swollen. Later, the skin peeled off his palm. A dream, yes, but real enough to leave a scar. On Sunday night, May 3rd, 1868, Don Bosco gathered his boys and told them everything. He stood in front of hundreds of young men and described what he saw. He did not sugarcoat it. He did not soften the horror. But he also did not stop at the terror. He gave them the way out. They have superiors. Let them obey them. They have rules. Let them observe them. They have the sacraments. Let them receive them. Then he said this: "Do you want to avoid hell? Go to confession. Truly confess. Do not hold anything back out of shame. Be genuinely sorry. Make a firm resolution to change and follow through. But what about unforgiveness? What about the grudges? What about the person who hurt you and never said sorry? What about the family member who betrayed you? The spouse who wounded you? The friend who abandoned you? The colleague who slandered you?" Don Bosco saw all of it. Not in one dream about couples specifically, but woven through every vision he had about sin and damnation. He saw how unforgiveness worked like acid on the soul. How it started small, a tiny offense, a minor slight, something that could have been resolved with a single conversation. But instead of reconciling, people held on to it. They replayed it in their minds. They built a case against the offender. They collected evidence. They rehearsed their grievances. And with every repetition, the wound grew deeper. The bitterness spread. The grudge calcified into something so hard that even God's grace could barely penetrate it. Don Bosco had watched this pattern destroy families. He had seen husbands and wives living under the same roof but refusing to speak to each other for years. He had seen siblings cut off all contact over an inheritance dispute. He had seen parents disown children over a single mistake. He had seen friends become enemies over a misunderstanding that could have been cleared up in 5 minutes if either party had been willing to humble themselves and ask what happened. And in his confessional, he heard the poison seeping out. "I will never forgive him. She does not deserve my mercy. He should have apologized first. She needs to admit she was wrong before I will even consider forgiving her. I have every right to be angry. The offense was too great. The wound is too deep. Some things are unforgivable." Every time someone said those words, Don Bosco felt his heart break, because he had seen where that road led. He had stood at the bronze gate and watched souls crash through because they held onto resentments they thought were justified. They carried their grievances like shields, believing they were protecting themselves. But the shield became a chain, and the chain pulled them down. In May 1873, during the month dedicated to Mary, Don Bosco decided to find out for certain. He prayed and offered masses every single day. He begged God and the Blessed Virgin to reveal one thing: what drags the most souls into hell? On May 31st, 1873, he gave his boys the answer. He said this was not his own conjecture. It came from the Lord, and the answer was shocking in its simplicity, the lack of a firm, concrete resolution at the end of confession. Without a sincere decision to change, even the sacrament becomes ineffective and sins are repeated. People go to confession. They say the words. They list the sins. But they do not truly resolve to change. They do not let go of the resentment. They do not forgive. They walk out of the confessional still clinging to the anger, the bitterness, the grudge. And so they confess the same sins over and over. And eventually, they stop confessing at all. And that is the road to hell. Don Bosco said there are boys who griped at the start of the school year and are still griping. Boys who were doing poorly in studies and are still doing no better. Why? Because they never made a real resolution to change. They never cut the trap. They never picked up the knife of confession and actually severed the sin. And unforgiveness is one of the strongest traps of all. It is linked to pride. I was wronged, so I have the right to be angry. It is linked to disobedience. God commands me to forgive, but I refuse. It is linked to anger. I will hold on to this rage because it makes me feel powerful. And it is linked to human respect. If I forgive, people will think I am weak. But there is something else Don Bosco noticed, something that made unforgiveness even more dangerous. It compounds. One grudge leads to another. You refuse to forgive your brother for a comment he made at dinner. So when he asks you for help moving next month, you say no. Then he gets angry at your refusal. So he does not invite you to his daughter's wedding. Then you cut off contact completely. And 5 years later, you are both miserable, both convinced the other person is the problem, and both absolutely certain that you are justified in your resentment. And all of it started with a single comment that could have been forgiven in 10 seconds. Don Bosco knew a family in Turin. The father and son had a falling out over a business decision. The son thought the father had cheated him. The father thought the son was ungrateful. Neither one would budge. Neither one would apologize. Neither one would even speak to the other except through intermediaries. This went on for 3 years. 3 years of holidays spent apart. 3 years of the mother crying because her family was broken. 3 years of grandchildren growing up without knowing their grandfather. 3 years of bitterness poisoning everything. Don Bosco tried to intervene. He invited the father to confession. The man came. He confessed his sins. But when Don Bosco asked about the son, the father said he had done nothing wrong. The son owed him an apology. Until that happened, there would be no reconciliation. Don Bosco asked the father a simple question. Do you want to see your son in heaven? Of course, the father said. Then you need to forgive him. Because if you die holding this grudge, you might not make it there yourself, the father protested. But I am the one who was wronged, and Christ was wronged more than you ever will be, Don Bosco replied. And from the cross, he said, Father, forgive them. He did not wait for an apology. He did not demand they admit they were wrong. He forgave while they were still driving the nails. Can you do less? The father went silent. Tears filled his eyes, and he broke. That very day he went to his son's house. He knocked on the door. When the son answered, the father said 3 words, I forgive you. The son stared at him for a moment. Then he said, I forgive you too. And they embraced, and the family was restored. Don Bosco told this story to his boys. He said, that is how forgiveness works. It does not wait for the other person to deserve it. It does not require a perfect apology. It does not demand that the other person change first. It simply lets go. It releases the debt. It says, I will not let this destroy me or you or us. But here is the part that terrified everyone who heard it. Don Bosco said if that father had died before he forgave his son, he would have gone to hell. Not because the business dispute was a mortal sin, but because the refusal to forgive became a mortal sin. Because unforgiveness is a rejection of God's mercy. And if you reject God's mercy, you cannot receive it. And if you cannot receive it, you cannot be saved. Don Bosco saw boys fall into hell because they refused to forgive. Not just others, but themselves. They carried guilt like a chain. They carried resentment like a knife. And when they stood at the bronze gate and looked back, they saw God's mercy chasing them, trying to pull them back. But they had run so far, so fast, that they crashed through the gate before mercy could catch them. Here is what the vision shows. Unforgiveness does not stay in your head. It does not stay in your heart. It becomes a weight on your soul. Every time you choose bitterness over mercy, you tie another thread to that rope the devil holds. Every time you refuse to reconcile, you take another step down that beautiful road lined with roses. And the farther you go, the harder it is to turn back. Don Bosco knew this because he spent his life hearing confessions. He heard boys confess the same sins week after week. He heard adults come back year after year with the same struggles. And he realized that the problem was not the sin itself. The problem was the lack of a true, firm, concrete resolution to change. People wanted forgiveness without transformation. They wanted absolution without amendment. And that does not work. So what is the way out? Don Bosco gave specific instructions, and he did not just preach them from a pulpit. He lived them in the confessional for hours every single day. First, confession must be complete. Do not hide sins out of shame. Do not sugarcoat. Do not minimize. Lay it all out. Don Bosco said he could always tell when someone was holding something back. They would confess a list of small sins, then pause, then say, "And that is everything, Father." But their voice would waver, their hands would tremble, and Don Bosco would gently say, "Are you sure? Is there something you are finding difficult to say?" And often that simple question would break the dam. The real sin would come out, the affair, the theft, the lie that destroyed someone's reputation, the grudge held for 20 years, the hatred nursed in secret. And once it came out, the relief was immediate. The person would weep. They would thank him. They would say, "I have been carrying that for so long. I did not know I could be free of it." Second, be truly sorry. Not just sorry you got caught or sorry for the consequences. Sorry because you offended God. Don Bosco said many people confess without contrition. They go through the motions. They recite the formula. But their hearts are still attached to the sin. They still want to keep it. They're only confessing because they feel obligated, or because they want to receive communion, or because their spouse made them come. That kind of confession is worthless. Worse than worthless. It is sacrilege. True sorrow means you would rather die than commit that sin again. True sorrow means you see the sin the way God sees it, as an offense against infinite love. True sorrow means you are willing to do whatever it takes to make sure it never happens again, even if it costs you everything. Third, make a firm resolution. Not, "I will try." Not, "I hope I can do better," but "I will, with God's grace, never do this again." Don Bosco said this was the part where most people failed. They confessed the sin, they felt sorry, but they had no plan to avoid it in the future. They went right back to the same environment, the same friends, the same habits that led them into sin in the first place, and they fell again, and again, and again. A firm resolution means you cut off the near occasions of sin. If you have a drinking problem, you do not go to bars. If you struggle with lust, you do not watch movies that trigger you. If you have a habit of gossip, you do not hang around with people who gossip. If you struggle to forgive someone, you do not rehearse their offenses in your mind every night before bed. You change your life, you build guardrails, you create new patterns, you replace the sin with virtue, you fill the void with grace, and fourth, follow through. Take the penance seriously, avoid the near occasions of sin, change your life. Don Bosco said penances are not punishments, they are medicine. They are meant to heal the wound the sin created. So when the priest gives you 3 Hail Marys, do not just rattle them off as fast as you can. Pray them slowly, mean them, let them sink into your soul. Let Mary intercede for you. Let her take your broken heart and present it to her Son. And if your penance is to forgive someone, do it. Do not wait until you feel like it. Do not wait until the other person deserves it. Do not wait until you fully understand why you should. Just do it. Say the words, "I forgive you," even if you have to say them through gritted teeth, even if you have to say them while crying, even if you have to say them 100 times before you actually feel it. Say them. Because forgiveness is not a feeling, it is a decision. But Don Bosco also knew that human beings are weak. We fall, we fail, we slip back into old patterns. We hold onto resentments even when we know we should not. We nurse grudges even when we know they are killing us. So he gave the boys tools, and he insisted they use them every single day. Frequent confession. Don Bosco recommended weekly confession. Not because people commit mortal sins every week, but because regular confession keeps the soul clean. It prevents small sins from becoming big sins. It prevents grudges from calcifying into permanent bitterness. Weekly confession is like taking out the trash before the house overflows. Daily Mass. Don Bosco made this the center of life at the oratory. The boys woke up, went to Mass, received communion, and then started their day. Every single day, daily Mass reorients your entire life around Christ. It starts each day by saying, "Jesus, I am yours." And when you start your day that way, it becomes much harder to hold on to grudges or refuse forgiveness, because you have just received the body and blood of the one who forgave his executioners. Devotion to Mary. Don Bosco called her Mary Help of Christians. He built a massive church in Turin dedicated to her. He taught the boys to pray the rosary every single day. And he said, "Mary is the one who softens hard hearts. She is the one who melts frozen souls. She is the one who teaches us to forgive as she forgave the men who killed her son." Visits to the Blessed Sacrament. Don Bosco said there are 2 things the devil is deadly afraid of: fervent communions and frequent visits to the Blessed Sacrament. Do you want the Lord to give you many graces? Visit him often. Do you want the devil to flee from you? Visit Jesus often. A visit does not have to be long. 5 minutes, 10 minutes. Just sit in front of the tabernacle and let Jesus look at you. Let him see your wounds and heal them. Meditation. Don Bosco gave the boys short reflections on the Passion of Christ, on the lives of the saints, on death, judgment, heaven, hell. He told them to read one meditation every morning and spend a few minutes thinking about how it applied to their lives. Meditation is where you confront yourself. where you face the ugly truth about the sin you are clinging to and the grace you are rejecting. Spiritual reading. Don Bosco started an entire publishing operation to flood Italy with good Catholic literature. He told the boys to read for at least 15 minutes every day. The lives of the saints, the Gospels, books on prayer. Because what you put in your mind shapes what comes out of your heart. Spiritual reading is like fertilizer for the soul. And finally, prayer for enemies. This was the nuclear option. Don Bosco taught the boys to pray for people who hurt them. Specific prayers. By name. Lord, bless the boy who punched me yesterday. Help him see what he is doing wrong, and help me to forgive him. This is agony at first. Your every instinct rebels against it, but when you pray for your enemy, you are no longer feeding the resentment. You are cutting the rope. And over time, your heart changes. You start to see the person differently, and forgiveness becomes possible. These were not optional extras for Don Bosco. These were survival tools. The knives and swords lying on the ground next to the traps. Pick them up or fall. And for unforgiveness specifically, Don Bosco had one more piece of advice. Pray for the person who hurt you, not because they deserve it, not because it makes you feel good, but because it breaks the chain. When you pray for your enemy, you are no longer feeding the resentment. You are no longer nursing the grudge. You are cutting the trap. There's a reason Jesus said, forgive 70 times 7, not because the other person earns it, but because you need to be free. Every act of forgiveness is a step back up that sloping road. Every time you let go of bitterness, you are picking up the knife of grace and severing the devil's rope. Don Bosco's boys took this seriously. After he told them the dream, confessions increased. Boys who had been holding back sins came forward. Boys who had been going through the motions started taking it seriously. And Don Bosco saw the change. He saw boys who had been angry, bitter, resentful start to soften. He saw reconciliation happen. He saw friendships restored. He saw families healed. Because here is the truth. The person you refuse to forgive is not the one suffering most. You are. That grudge lives in your chest. That resentment eats at your peace. That bitterness poisons your joy. And if you carry it all the way to the Bronze Gate, it will drag you through. In 1888, Don Bosco died. By that time, the Salesian Society had 250 houses around the world. 130,000 boys had passed through his schools. Over 6,000 of them became priests. The society still exists today. It is the second largest religious order in the world. And everywhere Salesians go, they teach the same thing Don Bosco taught. Confession, communion, devotion to Mary, frequent reception of the sacraments, and true, firm, concrete resolutions to change. But the deeper lesson, the one that cuts to the bone, is this. Hell is not just a place for murderers and thieves. It is a place for ordinary people who made ordinary choices to hold onto ordinary grudges, who said, I will never forgive, who chose bitterness over grace, who walked down a beautiful road lined with roses and ignored the traps at their feet. Don Bosco's vision was not given to scare people into submission. It was given as a warning, a lifeline, a map. He saw the road, he saw the traps, he saw the Bronze Gate, and he came back to tell us how to avoid it. Confess your sins, forgive your enemies, make firm resolutions, follow through, pick up the tools God gives you and cut the devil's rope before it is too late. The vision ended with Don Bosco's hand pressed against the wall. One touch, 1 second. And the pain was so real, so searing that his hand blistered. And that was just the outer wall. The first of 1,000 walls, millions of miles from the real fire. Imagine what the center must be like. But Don Bosco did not end his account with the pain. He ended with the tools, the sacraments, the prayers, the devotions, the way out. Because the God who showed him hell also showed him heaven. The God who revealed the danger also provided the rescue. The God who dragged him through the Bronze Gate also led him back out. And the message is clear. You do not have to go there. You do not have to fall into the trap. You do not have to crash through the Bronze Gate. But you have to choose. You have to let go. You have to forgive. You have to confess. You have to change. Not tomorrow. Not next year. Now. One of the boys who heard Don Bosco tell this vision was named Michael Rua. He became Don Bosco's successor. He led the Salesian Society after the saint died. And he said this, Don Bosco's dream of hell changed my life. I never forgot it. Every time I was tempted to sin, every time I was tempted to hold a grudge, every time I wanted to refuse forgiveness, I remembered that vision. I remembered the boys falling. I remembered the Bronze Gate. I remembered the tools on the ground, and I picked them up. That is the legacy. That is what Don Bosco left behind. Not just a story, not just a warning, but a decision. Will you pick up the tools, or will you keep walking down the road? Will you forgive, or will you hold the grudge all the way to the gate? Will you confess truly, or will you keep making excuses? Will you change, or will you keep falling into the same trap? Don Bosco saw what happens when you refuse to forgive. He saw what happens when you nurse resentment instead of seeking reconciliation. He saw what happens when you make resolutions and never keep them. He saw the end of that road, and he came back to warn us. The Bronze Gate is real, The traps are real, the fire is real, but so is the rescue, so is the mercy, so is the grace, so are the tools lying on the ground waiting for you to pick them up. Confession, communion, prayer, devotion to Mary, forgiveness, these are not optional, they are the way out. So here's the question. What grudge are you holding? What resentment are you nursing? What person have you refused to forgive? What sin have you been confessing for years without ever truly resolving to change? What trap has your foot caught in while you keep walking down the road pretending everything is fine? Don Bosco would tell you to stop, turn around, pick up the knife, cut the rope, confess truly, forgive completely, change entirely, because the road ends at a bronze gate, and once you crash through, there is no coming back. But today, right now, you still have time. The tools are still on the ground. The sacraments are still available. The mercy is still reaching for you. The choice is still yours. Pick them up.